Yeah, I'll try to do my best to make things clearer rather than less confused, but we'll see. So I guess like one of the most common kind of questions I get, especially after an introduction like that on the content side, is like, when did you start working with economy as a subject, and why, and all this kind of stuff. And so just to kind of like start there, the whole thing started, I was doing, and there were a number of projects I had done on the U.S. Department of Defense website, like the U.S. military's website, from 2004 to 2006. I was really like working with that. And the thing that had interested me about that was that there was a section of the website. I mean, the first thing was that I found it kind of surprising that the U.S. military actually had a website. I mean, now it wouldn't be surprising at all, but I don't know, like in 2003, 2004, I was kind of surprised for some reason. So anyway, I was doing some work on I found it kind of interesting that they had a website, and that they had this whole section of the website which was called was an imagery data bank. And what was interesting about that to me was just that, like, it was very unclear who these images were actually for. So they had made, and also all the images were copyright free. So they had like thousands of images available online in a searchable data bank that were high resolution and copyright free. So they were clearly like meant to be distributed, and there was some kind of implication that they were meant for the press, but of course the press wouldn't really use them because they were kind of tainted being official US military images. So there were a number of projects I did related to that archive, and they were all more or less about trying to figure out who these things were addressed to, who the archive was there for, and the kind of discrepancies between the stated intentions of the military website and the actual kind of way in which these things circulated. So yeah, I kind of burned out on that a little bit, or I mean, it wasn't like a burnout really, but it was just kind of an exhaustion of dealing with that same material, even though it was endless, you know. I mean, it was getting exponentially bigger, this imagery data bank. And so at the time was kind of, I was living in Berlin, and I just run into a bunch of different people from different, you know, milieus and like different places and stuff, who all had said at some point, you know, that they read The Economist, the magazine, and you know, this business weekly that is out of the UK but is kind of for international audience. And I myself had I was working for another artist at the time, and was traveling a lot to do installation work for her. And so I was in airports a lot, and I was actually like reading The Economist as well. And we all had this kind of, it seemed like everybody was reading The Economist as a kind of like, to gain some access to the way the enemy thinks or something. Like that was kind of the implication. Some people actually, you know, sort of said this, like, so I just started doing a little bit of research on that, and the whole kind of history of The Economist. And actually there is a kind of long tradition of this, reading The Economist to know how the enemy thinks. It goes all the way back to Marx, actually, in the 1860s. And Lenin also in the Soviet Union, you know, has like these, I found these letters that he had addressed to certain departments that they should subscribe to The Economist to be able to understand how Western capitalism was kind of describing itself. So that was kind of one half of it, but the other half was that I was kind of curious about the role of photography within the magazine, and the reason was because it always was kind of indirect, you know, that they never, like when there's a story about some, some IPO, for example, like an initial public offering of a company on a stock exchange. It's very difficult to actually take a picture of that. You know, it doesn't, you can of course take a picture of the ceremony of the listing when they're at the exchange and they ring the bell or something like that. You can take a picture of the office building where they're located. You can take a picture of the heads of the companies that are doing it. But the actual entry of that company onto the exchange, what that entails is not something which is doesn't really exist in the same kind of visual register that photography operates within. But there's a lot of photographs in The Economist, so I was kind of curious about like why are there so many photographs here? And of course there's a lot of obvious reasons one can come up with very quickly. But it was something I was kind of pursuing. And one thing that was really one of the first kind of real points I felt like I understood something about it was that when you open up The Economist in the first couple of pages, after the table of contents, you always have this section called The World This Week, which is like a summary of the events from the week. And it's divided into two sections. One is called business and the other is called politics. And the business side is always just, you know, stories, little like 1 or 2 sentence summaries of events that have occurred in the business world. And the politics side is that, but also photographs. So there's never any photographs on the business side of The World This Week. And this I felt like was a kind of revelation of like a certain way in which the kind of The Economist's view of the world was structured. So I did that for a while. I was just like, I was reading The Economist. I was getting The Economist every week and, you know, trying to do these analyses and stuff. And I got kind of bored with it after a while. I think the breaking point was when I picked up the history of The Economist that they had commissioned to be written. Like the editors of The Economist had commissioned to have this thing written on the 150th anniversary of The Economist. And it was like, you know, an 800-page tome that was written by some kind of crime fiction writer or something. But it was like, it's kind of hard to believe that it was written by a crime fiction writer because it was just incredibly boring. I mean, I think there's no way to really make that history interesting the way in which they wanted to write it, you know, which was all about like, you know, going from one editor to another and the big story around the founding editor, James Wilson, and all this kind of stuff. And it turns out, I mean, there's a lot of interesting little details and stuff, but a lot of those details aren't even really in that book. So I was kind of trying to, you know, find out these other kind of historical intersections with their history that were written out of that history. And one of them is, for example, the big role that The Economist plays in Karl Marx's work in Das Kapital. And also, it turns out, I found out that there were a couple of like encounters actually between Marx and the founding editor of The Economist. None of that stuff is in the Economist's biography, but you can find it elsewhere if you're kind of really looking for it. But anyway, I got bored with it. So I kind of extended the search or the project into developing a general archive of what I was calling images of economy at the time. And this is like 2006, early 2007. But it really started in 2006. That's when the expansion thing on my end happened. So yeah, in 2006 I started this big archive, and it was called like just loosely Images of Economy. It wasn't really a like project for presentation yet. It was more just a research. And so I had like, I was living in Berlin at the time, and I was reading I was trying to learn German and stuff too. So I was like, this was part of just a general part of my life was, getting German newspapers, reading them. And then I would, on the weekends, get The Guardian and Financial Times and stuff like that. And the reason that the archive was kind of possible was basically because there was such a lack of these images of economy. So there weren't really, it was really kind of predictable. The categories were quite straightforward. To some extent, I mean, you could really of course you could make more interesting categories, but the basic categories were buildings, people who run companies, images of money, bills and coins and stuff like that. And so that was kind of the starting point, and then it got more, I started developing, as I was collecting those things, I started to deal more with how those images related to the stories and the kind of metaphoric way in which they did that, and not just metaphoric, but all different kinds of tropes. So the way that these, the kind of rhetoric that attached the images to the story is what I was really trying to archive. And basically what happened was that the credit crisis happened, and then these images weren't really rare at all anymore. I mean, within a week of the fall of 2007, you could collect as many images as I had collected for the prior year and a half. And this is because there was a crisis, and suddenly, these images, which were kind of kept to the business and finance sections of the newspaper, suddenly were in the more general, on the front pages and in the politics section and stuff like this. So I basically decided at that point, I'll just move forward here. This is this is from a contribution that I had made to this journal called Open in the Netherlands, which has recently stopped making print versions because of the whole budget cuts and stuff, and now they're just an online publication. And this was the last page of that contribution, which just lists all the sources for the images that come before, and there's these are basically the images. So this is the title of the thing was just a selection from an archive of images of economy. And this is just, that's what it was. These are pages that were from this archive that I had been constructing years before. These are just the financial indices. They often have advertisements for watches in them, otherwise there's really no imagery. This is the building facade section. And this is crisis time. Then suddenly it was all this kind of stuff. So yeah, when these kind of images started appearing all the time, it made my whole archive project really boring. And I decided to kind of take another approach. So I dropped this stuff for a while. I came back to it a few years later and made this book called Reading the Economist. And a film about the first photograph to be printed by mechanical means in a newspaper, which was in 1880. But that was a few years later. In the meantime, I started working with, I was receiving all these letters from my father, not really letters, but cards and stuff. He was just sending a lot of mail, which was kind of seemed anachronistic, I didn't get much mail from anybody else, but my father, I would get these cards and all this kind of stuff. I started noticing that the letter, the envelopes that they were sent in were covered with these postage stamps from earlier moment. So they weren't contemporary postage stamps, they were postage stamps from the 80s, or in some cases the 60s, sometimes even earlier. And so I started realizing that he was using his stamp collection to send unnecessary mail to me. And yeah, with a little questioning, I found out this was also happening to my sisters and everyone else that I kind of knew who also knew my father. So that was one kind of point of departure for this other approach that I was thinking of. Well, maybe what I should do is just show an excerpt from the film that came out of that, which is him kind of, it's like a little monologue from my father, and then it's like a very short kind of response to that, or reading of it, or explanation of it, or whatever from me. And it's a kind of preface to the film, which is called At Face Value, which I'll explain further after that. Okay.
No, when I started putting them on the letters, and I can't tell you whether that was 2, 3, or 4 years ago, but it would have been stopping collecting, that is, stopping saving them from the ones I bought at the post office, happened at the same time, because it's all really part of the same process. I realized at that point that all this money that I had invested really wasn't a very good investment at all. I didn't lose anything, but I certainly didn't earn anything on that investment. And the investment was so small, though, one wonders, I suppose if I put it in the savings account, there would be more there, but it was small enough that you probably wouldn't have done that, and, So the key thing was, to spur of the moment, I was in a mall. I believe I was at a conference or something, and for some reason I was in a mall, and I saw a stamp and coin shop. So I went in, and just out of curiosity, I was wondering, how much a sheet of stamps would go for today, And I forget whether I asked about a particular stamp or whatever, but the answer came back loud and clear that most sheets of stamps, that person there would buy them at face value. Mm-hmm. And I checked it out with another place, I think I did that, and got the same answer, and I realized, so my stamps are worth just what they say on them.
Just before turning on the camera here, he asked what exactly I wanted him to speak about. I said that what I really wanted was for him to not speak as a historian or a stamp collector, both of which he was, although his identity as a stamp collector was being put in question by his recent practice of using stamps from his collection as postage on bills and letters. I tried to explain that I was interested in the role stamp collecting had played for me as a child in learning what value is. I remembered how he used to always say that as long as you bought the stamps at face value, that is, the value that is printed on them, you would never lose money because you could always exchange them for at least that amount of money, if not more. So I just wanted to talk to him in that capacity, as someone who has collected stamps and believed that such a collection was, among other things, a safe investment. He had taught me this principle as a child, and I now realized that it did not take inflation into account. Yeah, so that's the kind of opener of At Face Value. And what happens after that is this, basically. This is a stamp from 1923 that was used in Germany. And 1923 is like the kind of high point of the Weimar hyperinflation. And I had, I was living in Berlin. I had just moved to Amsterdam when I made this film, but a lot of the material had been accumulated from when I had been living in Berlin. And I had this, I was looking basically for these banknotes that were overprinted with new values on them. So like where you would have a banknote for 100 marks, and then overprinted on it is like 10,000 or a million or something like that. And I had seen a couple of these in books, you know, just the history books from when you're like, you know, doing like high school world history or whatever. And so that image had kind of, you know, was in my head. But when I went to actually go find them, there actually weren't very many of these at all. There's only 2 or 3 of these that were printed. But there were tons of postage stamps that used this overprinting to revalue during the inflation and then hyperinflation. And so I started collecting some of these and you know, just kind of looking at the sort of trajectory there, what happened with the stamp design in relation to this overprinting to deal with the rapidly changing values of the currency. And basically discovered that like this stamp, which is begins circulating in the early part of 1923, before it was put into circulation with the overprint, this stamp was made. So you can see, for example, that this one is 20,000, this one is 200, so this is obviously before. And then after 200, it becomes 250,000, and later 2 million. And this is like, you know, within just sometimes even weeks. But this stamp was really interesting to me because it was basically the kind of threshold stamp where they, after this is the design for everything. It's just numbers that change, but the design is the same. So all these designs were made completely abstract. There's no figuration at all. And I started kind of, I basically decided I would make this stamp, the overprint one here, the kind of center of the film. And basically, let's see here. Yeah. So the thing that was interesting to me about it was that, like, yeah, okay, it's the last image that, or it's the last like figurative stamp, you can say, before the fall of the Deutschmark to like levels at which it would have to completely reset itself afterwards. But I wanted to kind of explore the idea that they changed to this number thing, not just because it was cheaper to design, you know, this like abstract, just written 200 or whatever number on it, but also that like, that there was some kind of other level of meaning in something like this that would not be there when a number is simply overprinted with another number. That when you overprint a representation of your kind of national identity, like this particular group, in this case, like these 3 agricultural workers, when you know, have these images of these figures being kind of overtaken by economic events, you know, literally by this kind of abstract sphere of money, that actually communicates something beyond, you know, that, 2 months ago, what I could buy for 12 marks, I now have to pay 20,000 for. That it kind of had some, yeah, some meaning beyond the economic sphere. And this was a lot also with this, you know, kind of going back to this, reading The Economist, the business and politics section, that here you had a kind of image which is difficult to categorize in terms of business and politics. It's both. It's very much a you know, a kind of economy image, but it's also very much a political image. And this image is maybe not so political, but this one is. So what was really interesting in the kind of this search, which also, like, a lot of it was, I went and did this interview with my father, which was kind of funny, and went through like some of his old collection, because I, you know, as a kid, I like collected stamps and under his wing or whatever. Yeah, he was getting rid of this collection, and it basically because he found it worthless. But of course, there's a lot of historical value to these things. And so the one stamp that I found in his collection, which really interested me then, was this stamp right here, the one that says Molly Pitcher on it. And the reason is because it's, yeah, you can see the obvious similarities, but this stamp is printed in 1923, the German one, and the Molly Pitcher one is 1928. It's in the United States, and it was actually, it also, like, this technique of overprinting here, I mean, they weren't overprinting to change the monetary value of the stamp. They were here actually overprinting to change the sort of symbolic value, the historical reference point. And what the historical reference point was is that 1928, it's like there were a lot of anniversaries of historic battles from the American War for Independence from Britain. But they were, you know, on their way to the Great Depression. And so already government funding was cutting back to certain departments. The postage department was hit in 28. And, you know, one of the big things that the postage department does is commission commemorative stamps for, like, you know, big national historic events. And so it was like kind of problematic that it's like, okay, 150th anniversary of the war for independence of this country, you know, we have to issue commemorative stamps. We have to acknowledge this, but we don't have the money to hire designers to do it and to redo the plates and all that stuff. So, I mean, I don't know whether they had actually studied this particular stamp from Germany 5 years earlier, but clearly this kind of idea that the stamp could be revalued not only economically but also in terms of its historical significance was like of the moment. And this is the only stamp that was ever done like this in the United States because it failed. I mean, like, people didn't understand what the hell this was. It's like, I mean, it's kind of difficult to understand what it is. It's to celebrate the Battle of Monmouth. And in the Battle of Monmouth, there was this kind of mythical female figure in the war called Molly Pitcher, who was not like, there were many Molly Pitchers. It is just this kind of mythical figure, although many women claimed to have that name. And the figure is this woman who comes, and when her husband is, you know, who's operating the cannon, is killed in battle, she's the one who comes to bring water, but at that moment, you know, takes over the cannon and continues the fight. So that's who Molly Pitcher is. And this montage of that name over this kind of, yeah, the bust of George Washington was to celebrate this event. But this kind of technology of montage to revalue historically stamps, it only happened this one time in the U.S. So anyway, that film, like, kind of, it weaves these things together. It kind of looks at the stamp as like this surface for like an intersection between these economic events and this kind of more political forms of representation, or representation of political events or something. So after that, let's see here. Yeah, there's something else before, but I will show it this way. Okay. After that I started working on a film which was called In Place of Capital. And that film begins and ends with the bank ABN AMRO, basically. But it's not very clear in the film that this is the opening shot of the film. I'm just silencing it so I can kind of explain some stuff about it. It's not very clear. You might know it if you're familiar with the Zuidas business district in Amsterdam, but I'm sure most of you aren't, most people aren't. Even in Amsterdam, it's not like a particularly, you know, I mean, it's known, but it's not like a place where people hang out. And that's where ABN AMRO's headquarters are. This is not the ABN AMRO Bank building yet, but it will come up shortly. So this film was kind of determined to a large extent by my interaction. On the one hand, there's like two kind of paths. One was this interaction with ABN AMRO, which was a kind of failed attempt to get access to this one space within the bank, which was just the public foyer area on the inside. I wanted to do a long tracking shot there. And so I had written this, email to the public relations people asking, and they took it on. I mean, they didn't not acknowledge that I had written this thing, and we kind of had a discussion back and forth a little bit. And basically, in the end, they said that they didn't think that my project fit in with their policy concerning the visual arts. And this is in 2009, so I started looking into a little bit ABN AMRO's policy concerning the visual arts. And it's just really basic, just like Googling and stuff like that. And it just was a coincidence that 2 days before, there had been this kind of crisis, very small international crisis, which centered on a painting that, 17th century painting of an area of Amsterdam, the Gouden Bocht, which is the where they first started this, the big expansion of the canal belt in Amsterdam in the 17th century. And so it was this kind of painting of this real estate development. I'll show quickly. There's the painting. So this is where the film ends, is in the Rijksmuseum in front of this painting. There's nowhere in the film where you really understand that this has anything to do with ABN AMRO. There is a very small mention, because what happened was this painting, it was on loan to a museum in the US for some, show on Dutch masters. And this guy the Rijksmuseum had bought the painting the year before, 2008. The collector who sold it to the Rijksmuseum had actually kept it on the books in a couple of these banks for loans that he had with the bank. So it was collateral for these loans that he had taken out from, among other banks, ABN AMRO and JP Morgan Chase. And he defaulted on these loans in 2009, and so those banks tried to claim this painting. But, I mean, he had sold it to the Rijksmuseum the year before. He had just kept it on there as collateral. So there was this, this little episode where they had actually stopped the painting at the border in the US on its way back to the Rijksmuseum because JP Morgan Chase had filed this claim on it. And it was all kind of, it was resolved within a couple of days. Some judge had to kind of rule on it that, yes, indeed, the Rijksmuseum had legally purchased it, and it was just this guy who had kept it on illegally as collateral for these loans. But for several days, this image, the image of the painting was in the financial news of these, especially in the Netherlands. I mean, it wasn't outside of that. It wasn't this big international thing, but in the Netherlands, it was a big deal. So basically, that was kind of one story, and that was the beginning and the end of the film. And the middle of the film was about these photographs of the Royal Exchange in London that had been taken in 1845, just after the building had been built. And I'm going to play an excerpt from that section because I think it makes more sense to see a bit of it. It's a little bit long compared to the other one. It's like a 7-minute excerpt. Yeah. In what is generally considered the first photographically illustrated book, The Pencil of Nature, Henry Talbot writes, "If we proceed to the city and attempt to take a picture of the moving multitude, we fail, for in a small fraction of a second, they change their position so much as to destroy the distinctness of the representation. In 1845, just after the Royal Exchange had been built, Talbot made 4 exposures of it, knowing that this failure to represent the crowds around it would be repeated. It was the view that these images were missing something, the movement that had taken place in front of the camera, that led to the development of faster chemical processes and lenses, which would eventually make it possible not only to capture the fleeting poses assumed by a body in movement at any given instant, but also to reanimate those bodies in what would come to be known as the cinema some 50 years later. But at this moment, in the spring of 1845, that relation of capture had not yet been secured. Here before the Royal Exchange, in the 2 or 3 minutes it took to make this photograph, a moving multitude, a crowd of people, have disappeared. And in their place stands an empty forecourt, a pair of streets, and of course, the Royal Exchange, with its stone figures celebrating the very movement that to this day eludes photographic capture. The movement is past, but something is there in its place. This is how Karl Marx would describe the final phase in the circuit of money capital, after money has traveled through the production process into a sum of commodities, which then go to the market and are finally sold, at which point money is again returned to itself, plus some amount of surplus. In this final moment, when money re-emerges from its travels through the production process and the market, it is realized as capital, value that has bred value. Here, for a brief instant, it appears as self-increasing money. But the movement that has caused this increase immediately vanishes behind the same facade before which those people had disappeared in the spring of 1845. So while Talbot saw his image as lacking something, the clear representation of any moving body, Marx saw this lack as an expression of the capital relation. that when capital assumes the form of money, its movement, its history, vanishes. This is something that the increasing speed of photographic capture, through technological innovations in chemistry and optics, could not change. If anything, this increased speed of photographic capture would itself be used to decrease the amount of time capital would be stuck in production through the development of time and motion studies, reducing the duration of the most visible interruption in the process of accumulation, the time it takes capital to return to the money form, its passage through the production process, through the reduction of the number of motions needed for any given task. But the intensification of the division of labor that this would allow for was already being addressed by Marx in his Paris manuscripts of 1844. In these manuscripts, Marx defined money as the external common medium for turning an image into reality, and reality into a mere image. It would take Marx years to draw out this description of money more concretely, as a form in which the movement of capital vanishes. But this basic description of money, as a medium of exchange between image and reality, draws it close to the photography of that moment, where movement disappeared, leaving an image in its place, and where images, once photographed, entered a new industrial reality. So, yeah, that was like kind of the little motor at the center of that film, In Place of Capital. And it gets, it's kind of, Vim and I had talked about like whether or not to actually discuss the works in the exhibition here so much, and this is kind of where it starts to come to that. And so I will just talk really briefly about one of the two works, which is a kind of direct development of some of the ideas from In Place of Capital. In particular, this idea that okay, yeah, this problem that well, this kind of situation where there was a technical failure, or what was seen as a kind of technical limitation of photography in the mid-19th century. Actually, I mean, In Place of Capital, I really wanted to look at that as a kind of, not as a failure, but as an actual representation of something else. So while it wasn't a representation of the you know, this instant of people there in front of the Royal Exchange, it wasn't an image of the crowded nature of that place at that moment. It was an image of the kind of disappearance at the heart of the circulation of capital. So in Unsupported Transit, which is one of the films that is in the exhibition that will open on Friday, let me just pull it up so I can run it in the background and explain one small, relatively small thing about it. this is also, I just take off the sound on it. Basically, this technical limitation in the mid-19th century later on will be used actively within photography to produce certain types of images, and it's especially used in architectural photography. You know, when you want to take a picture of just a building without anything else around it, and you know, you kind of stack on these neutral density filters, and you shoot at a really tiny aperture in order to be able to have a long exposure in which all the kind of cars moving by and all the people walking by don't get captured on the film. But I was interested a little more in particular in unsupported transit with this form, this kind of hybrid form of film or photography, time-lapse photography, which has become so popular and widespread. It's such a kind of ubiquitous form now on YouTube or Vimeo or whatever. You know, you'll find tons of examples of time lapses, just because of the availability of it now and the affordability of it with digital photography. But yeah, so it's a really time-lapse photography is it's something that a lot of architects will actually commission some time-lapse photographer or filmmaker to document the construction of their building. Also, urban development, city planners and these kind of institutions will also commission time lapses. I guess the most famous one now, recent, is this time lapse that they made of the Freedom Tower in New York. Before that, the first time I encountered it was in relation to the renovations in MoMA. They had also done this kind of time-lapse thing. So it's very widespread in documenting construction, but it was kind of developed more for natural, investigations into natural phenomenon, like the opening of a flower and these kind of things. We've all seen these kind of films where you see a flower open in 3 seconds or something. So I wanted to, in unsupported transit, to look at this particular mechanism within time-lapse photography that allows for the documentation of a really long process, like the construction of a building, over, let's say a 5-year period or something, that allows one to be able to see it as a kind of smooth, singular movement. And at the heart of that whole mechanism is the long exposure. And basically, what that means is if you have a building that's being constructed over a 5-year period, let's say you take 5 photographs of it a day, and then you play it back at whatever that would, I don't know, it plays back at 24, 25 frames per second, something like that. You have several minutes of the building, literally kind of just bloop, erecting itself. And of course, all of the work and whatnot involved in that erection gets removed in this kind of a film or photograph. So I wanted to approach this thing. This is the site that the unsupported transit is set on is this new stock exchange that's being built in Shenzhen in China. Rem Koolhaas's firm OMA is building it, and I just kind of was by chance given an opportunity to kind of be on the site. And so I had this plan that I would shoot it basically as a kind of section of a time lapse. So this comes from a shoot where I was there for 12 days, and I just shot a lot of different kind of views and whatnot of it, but in slower frame rates than you would normally shoot a film. So it's not shot at 24 frames per second. The shots vary depending on the particular one, anywhere from 3 frames per second to 7 or 8 frames per second. But then they are all played back at their actual rate that they were shot at. So in a time lapse, if you shot at 3 frames per second, it would be played back at 24 and it would be 8 times faster. This, if it's shot at 3 frames per second, it's played back at 3 frames per second. And so what you can see then is this actual, what happens from the long exposure. So you'd kind of see the traces of the faster movements that normally would disappear when it's played back at a faster rate. They remain there. So the basic idea around like the kind of how technically this film was going to be made is that it would be a kind of time lapse in like an excerpt from this time lapse played in slow motion in real time. And that with this you could then like see this aspect of the time lapse that removes one movement at the expense of another. And yeah, just conceptually for me it was an interesting thing because time-lapse photography has become this form of cities kind of advertising their own urban development. So it really has become this way of showing a particular form of economic growth. And at the heart of this, system is the erasure of a certain kind of movement, and in this case, it's the movement of the kind of everyday work that is entailed to, in the construction of such a development project. So yeah, that's basically unsupported transit. There's the other work in the show is from a couple of years later, this year. This was shot in 2011. Returning to the site now, it's actually finished. It's not in operation yet, or it may be, I don't know. In the spring it wasn't. And most of that film is actually shot in the interior of the exchange, which is kind of an interesting thing because you don't really need a trading floor in a stock exchange anymore. So there is no trading floor in the Shenzhen Stock Exchange. There's just a ceremonial hall and a like completely non-public server farm, basically. So yeah, that film was mostly shot in the ceremonial hall. But that's an installation and it's a little more, I'm not gonna talk about that one so much. I think I will just leave it here because it's been like too long. I was supposed to be 45 minutes and I think it's closer to an hour now. So I'll stop there. Maybe there are some questions. This is a very strange setup to like be the sort of like object of a anatomical dissection. Like, I feel like the top of my head is very much in view. Yeah.
What triggered you to?
Well, it was kind of, it really was in some ways this thing about like people reading The Economist. It was just some thing that like, it seemed like everybody was reading The Economist. And I was also reading it and I just became curious about this like phenomenon of these photographs in The Economist not ever really being, I mean, oftentimes they use some kind of humor or something with the photograph, but it's always some strange way, some indirect way that it relates to the story it was illustrating. So it kind of related on a formal level for me to this work that I had done with the Department of Defense imagery server, where it was very unclear like how these images actually related to an audience or the story or whatever.
Really started with this Economist. It's not that you were interested in what is the kind of political value or power of an image. Did you do research before?
No, it was, well, I mean, that's of course a part of it. I mean, I think this thing with The Economist, this like separate, there is something, for me I could see very clearly that there was some way in which photographs had a relation to something that could be described as political, that economics was that there was an attempt by institutions like The Economist and the Financial Times, and actually, like, in general, there is this kind of idea that economics is a sort of scientific discipline where things happen, and until there is a crisis, there is no real relation between those things and political, there's often like a discussion of market distortion, for example. It's like a really kind of typical phrase you will hear in talking about government intervention within a certain, if like an industry needs to be protected, like, agricultural subsidies in France or something like that. And most economists will say like, that's a market distortion. But there's no like, that kind of intervention is a market distortion, with the idea that like, the market is this natural thing which doesn't have anything to do with, which politics can only cause problems within and cause like malfunctions within it. No sense that like the market itself institutes a set of political relationships, and that there isn't, and also that that's a very political gesture to try to remove that from public discourse, basically. To say that what happens here can't really be depicted. It can't really, it's something which is too, it's kind of a classic move to say like, it's too technical to be able to go into it, something like that. So these kind of things, I just had a kind of sense about, like a feeling about that with economics and stories about economic events, that there was some kind of, that the lack of image there was some political element there that would be interesting to try to kind of pull apart. And then also, it's like both the lack of an image and the way that The Economist uses images. It's almost like using an image to demonstrate how it can't have a real relation to the story. So there, these things that like, and also that there is just this kind of like, when you see images in the financial section of a newspaper, they really feel like stock images. They don't feel like they were shot now or they needed to be or anything. It feels like it just comes from some kind of, like, stock of, because there's very rarely any kind of action until you have a crisis, and then those also are kind of stock images, but they're very like, they're much more animated and whatnot. But it's like when the economy is going okay, there's no images. There's only images when the economy starts to not go so well, when there is a crisis, because then people are affected by it and they want to then it is like a political story. But it's not like it is, I think the depoliticization of the market is a very political move. And I think the lack of images and the lack of variety and the way that they have these obscure relations to the stories and stuff, I think that's all a kind of, there's very much a set of power relations there that is like really problematic. So I was interested in that kind of stuff, and I felt like it wasn't that far away. For me, it wasn't a big leap to go from the Department of Defense imagery server to the archive of images of economy.
Any other questions?
Are you just in photographs or in the link between photographs and the narrative?
The links between photographs and?
And the narrative and the surrounding historiography economics or?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the imagery within economics is often not photographic. So there's a lot of imagery also within economic theory. There are a lot of images that are used, and not just like diagrams and stuff like that, but there's often descriptions. There's this notebook that Marx had kept in the 1860s on The Economist, and he's actually following a credit crisis in that market. And I had like sort of did a little book on this thing. And what's interesting there is that there's no images at all. It's before the photo illustrated press. But a lot of there's a lot of description of there's a lot of images, but they're in text. You know, there's situations described, there's settings laid out. So I don't think, for me, it's not so important that, or it's not it's the kind of definition of image isn't tied to photography. But of course, in a lot of the works that I've done, I've tried to kind of forge a link between some of the developments within photography, technologically, and the kind of way in which capital evades visual representation. Just because I think it's, those relationships can be constructed, but they have to be constructed. They're not like photography does not relate to the economic sphere, usually in the form of depiction. But there are a lot of structural relations, I think, that, and those relations often need to be narrated, and that's part of the construction. So for me, like the narration is often about developing the relation between these things. But yeah, I really think that like images are not just, you know, perspectival space representations or diagrams and graphs and stuff. Often images, you know, like in novels you have, you know, they're loaded with imagery, but it's not in a perspectival space. Was that I don't know if that was actually what you were asking, or?
Okay. Someone else has an urgent question? If not,
Or non-urgent?
we are around on Friday evening again for the opening, so there's always time then to ask some questions after the session. I think the only thing I can do is thank you for the presentation.
Thanks for listening.